I slammed the door on me when I was 25 years old and 4 months pregnant, and 3 years later, they came knocking again. Not because they missed me, not because they were sorry, but because they wanted something. So stay with me until the end, would. Because the last line my daughter's great-grandfather ever wrote is one you will not forget. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 28 years old now, and before I tell you what happened on my doorstep 3 years later, I need you to understand exactly what kind of house I grew up in, would. Because none of this makes sense without it. My parents' home was the kind of place that looked perfect from the street. A tall brick house with a manicured lawn and seasonal wreaths on the door, would. The kind of house neighbors pointed to when they wanted to describe what a successful family looked like. But inside those walls, love was never given freely. It was earned, and it was withdrawn the moment you stopped performing well enough to deserve it, would. I spent my whole childhood learning how to be the daughter my mother wanted to show off. Good grades, good posture, the right university, the right kind of quiet obedience at the dinner table. And for 25 years, I thought I had done everything right, until the one thing I could not control, would. An unplanned pregnancy from a relationship that ended before it truly began, unraveled every bit of approval I had spent a lifetime earning. 3 years ago, I stood on my parents' front porch with one suitcase in my hand and a positive pregnancy test folded into my coat pocket, would. And I remember the exact sound my mother's voice made when she said the words that ended our family as I knew it. You are humiliating this family. Get out and do not come back. My father did not say a single word. He simply stood behind her with the door held open, wide enough that I understood there was no version of this conversation where I was allowed to stay. The porch light above us was flickering that night, a weak, dying yellow bulb that buzzed every few seconds, would. And I remember thinking it was strange that the very last image I would carry of my childhood home was a broken light, and my mother's face, twisted into an expression I had never seen on her before. I was 25, 4 months along, and the father of my baby had vanished the moment I told him, would. He did not argue, he did not ask questions. He simply stopped answering his phone, stopped showing up, disappeared so completely it felt like erasing a person from existence. And when I turned to my own parents, the two people who were supposed to love me without conditions, would. They chose their reputation over their daughter. My mother had spent years building a certain image of herself. She sat on the board of a private charity foundation. She hosted dinner parties where she introduced me as her daughter, the financial analyst, would. Like I was an award she had won, rather than a person she had raised. And a pregnant, unmarried daughter did not fit neatly into that story. So I became something to be removed rather than someone to be helped. I found a tiny studio apartment above a dry cleaning shop, a kind of place where the pipes rattled all through the night, and the smell of chemical steam crept up through the floorboards. No matter how many times I opened the windows, I worked as long as my body would let me. Then I went on unpaid leave, and by the time my due date arrived, would. My savings account held less than $400. I called my mother once, from the parking lot of the hospital, my hands shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone twice before she answered. She let it ring for what felt like an eternity, and when she finally picked up, would. Her voice was cold enough to sting. This is the life you chose for yourself, Claire. Do not call this house looking for comfort. And then she hung up before I could say another word. I gave birth completely alone. No familiar hand to hold, no one to wipe the sweat from my forehead or tell me I was doing well. Except for a night nurse named Marisol, who stayed nearly half an hour past the end of her shift because she said she could not stand the thought of a woman bringing a baby into the world with no one beside her, would. I named my daughter Hazel because I wanted her to carry something warm and steady, something that could grow strong roots even in poor soil. Those first few weeks after she was born are honestly a blur of exhaustion and fear, would. I remember sitting on the edge of a secondhand crib at 2 in the morning, doing math in my head over and over, rent, formula, diapers, the last of my savings, trying to figure out how many weeks I had before everything ran out completely. There were nights I cried more than she did quietly, would. So she would not somehow sense it. And there were mornings I woke up and genuinely did not know how I was going to make it through the day. But I did, one day at a time, because that is simply what you do when someone smaller than you is depending on you to figure it out, would. The 3 years that followed were the hardest of my entire life, and somehow, at the very same time, they were the most meaningful. I built an entire world for Hazel out of almost nothing. I found steady work doing the books for a small home renovation company owned by a woman named Renata, would, who let me bring Hazel to the office on the days daycare fell through, who taught me how to stretch a single paycheck across every bill I owed, who became something like the mother figure I had lost the day I walked off that porch. I taught myself to patch a leaking pipe from online online videos at midnight. I learned to turn one rotisserie chicken into 4 different dinners. And most importantly, I learned that real love did not require permission, or approval, or a single dollar in the bank. Hazel grew into a bright, curious little girl who collected pine cones from the sidewalk and gave every stray cat in the neighborhood its own name. She never once felt like she was missing anything, because I made absolutely sure of it. On weekends, we would walk to the small public library 3 blocks from our house, and Hazel would pick out 5 books every single time. No matter how tired I was, no matter how much I wanted to just sit down, I read every one of them to her at bedtime, because I had promised myself early on that whatever else my daughter went without, she would never go without someone who showed up for her completely. We celebrated small victories, like they were enormous ones. A good grade on a coloring assignment, a wobbly bike ride down the sidewalk without training wheels, birthday party with exactly 4 other children, and a homemade cake because a bakery cake was not in the budget that year. And somehow those small, imperfect celebrations meant more to me than anything my own childhood birthdays, with their catered spreads and rented ponies, ever had. I was building something real, brick by brick, out of almost nothing. And for the first time in my life, nobody's approval mattered except my daughter's laughter. I had not spoken one word to my parents in over 2 years when the knock finally came. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and Hazel was standing on a step stool beside me in the kitchen, humming while she helped me stir pancake batter. And then I heard it. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks on the door of the small rental house I had finally been able to afford after Renata gave me a raise. I opened it expecting a delivery driver, and instead I found my mother standing there in an expensive cream-colored coat I did not recognize. My father a step behind her, both of them wearing the same tense, composed expressions I remembered from being dropped off on the first day of school. My mother's eyes moved past me almost instantly, scanning the room behind me, and when they landed on Hazel, who was peeking out curiously from behind my leg, something shifted across her face. It was not warmth, and it was certainly not remorse. It was calculation, sharp and immediate, and it turned my stomach colder than that flickering porch light ever had. "Claire," my mother said. Her voice suddenly softened into a tone I did not trust for even a single second. "We need to talk. It concerns your grandfather." She took a step forward and actually lifted her arms slightly, reaching toward Hazel as though she had some claim to a granddaughter she had never sent a birthday card to, never once asked about, never acknowledged existed. Until this very moment, my whole body went rigid. 3 years of complete silence, 3 years of absolutely nothing. And now here they were on my doorstep, reaching for my daughter as though she belonged to them. "What about him?" I asked, my voice flatter than I intended, my hand instinctively pulling Hazel closer against my side, standing there in that doorway. I felt 3 years of carefully rebuilt peace suddenly wobble under my feet, because some part of me, some small and stubborn part I thought I had buried a long time ago, still wanted to know why they had really come, still wanted, just for a second, to believe that maybe this time it was about me, and not about whatever they needed from me. My father cleared his throat and glanced sideways at my mother, clearly searching for the careful, rehearsed words that would get them exactly what they had driven 3 hours to come and collect. My mother's polished smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she caught herself. "He passed away 5 weeks ago," she said, "and there is something you need to know about his estate." My grandfather's name was Arthur, and I had not seen him since I was around 9 years old, back before some falling out I never fully understood pulled him completely out of our lives. I remembered him as a quiet man with rough, weathered hands, and a garage full of old clocks he liked to take apart and rebuild. A man who called me his little sparrow, and let me eat cereal for dinner whenever my parents were not around to disapprove. I had not thought about him in years, and hearing his name now, spoken by the same 2 people who had once thrown me out into the cold, felt like being handed the missing piece of a puzzle I had long since given up trying to finish. "What about his estate?" I asked again, sharper this time, because my mother still had not actually answered the question, and her eyes kept drifting back toward Hazel like she physically could not stop herself. My mother reached out again, her fingers stretching toward Hazel's small shoulder, and that was the moment Hazel finally stepped fully into view, clutching the small wooden bird she carried with her everywhere, and looked up at these 2 strangers with wide, cautious eyes. I watched my mother's carefully constructed smile freeze in place, then crack at the edges as she truly looked at my daughter for the first time. Studying the shape of her face, the set of her eyes, my mother's outstretched hand dropped to her side. She grabbed my father's sleeve instead, her knuckles going white against the fabric, and her voice came out as a whisper that did not sound like her at all. "That cannot be." She never finished the sentence, and she did not have to. I watched the realization spread across her face like a shadow crossing a room, and I finally understood that this visit had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with money. "Come inside," I said. Not because I wanted them there, but because I needed to hear whatever this was with my own 2 ears. And I was not about to have this conversation on a doorstep in front of the neighbors. We sat together in my small living room. Hazel settled quietly at my feet with her pine cones and her little wooden bird, Wood. And my father finally spoke, his voice low and businesslike, the same voice he used whenever he wanted to control a room. He explained that Arthur had died of a sudden stroke 5 weeks earlier, alone in the same house he had lived in for nearly 40 years, Wood. And that the will had been read the previous week in front of an attorney none of them recognized. My mother, who had fully expected to inherit the bulk of the estate as Arthur's only living child, had instead learned that the majority of his fortune, a fortune none of them had ever known existed, Wood, had been left almost entirely to me. I sat there completely stunned as my father explained it, his jaw tight with something that might have been resentment or might have been shame. Arthur, it turned out, had spent nearly 3 decades quietly buying up small rental properties across the city, purchasing them when they were considered worthless, and simply holding on to them as the neighborhood slowly grew around them. He never spent money on himself, never remarried after my grandmother passed away, never told a single soul what he was quietly building, and somehow, but through channels I still do not fully understand, he had learned everything. A distant cousin of mine, it turned out, had kept him informed for years, sending him updates my parents never asked her to send, photographs of Hazel taken from a careful distance at a public park, small notes about which job I had taken, which apartment I had moved into. Nothing invasive, just enough for an old man living alone to know that his family, the real family he still believed in, was surviving out there somewhere, even if he was not allowed to reach out and say so himself. Would. Arthur had rewritten his will 18 months before he died, cutting my mother out almost entirely, and leaving nearly everything, the properties, the savings, all of it, valued at just over $3.1 million to me and to Hazel, the great-granddaughter he had never once met, but had apparently decided to protect from a distance. Anyway, I sat there trying to picture Arthur in those final years, alone in that old house with his clocks and his radios, quietly reading updates about a granddaughter he was not allowed to call, watching from a distance as the family he came from turned its back on the one person who actually needed them, and never once stepping in to fix it the easy way, with money handed over while he was still alive, but instead choosing to wait to watch, Would, and to make absolutely sure that when his time came, his resources would land in the hands of the person who deserved them, rather than the people who had simply been born closest to him. There was something almost unbearably tender about that kind of quiet, patient love, with the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply shows up exactly when it is needed most. In a letter he left with his attorney, he had written a single line that the lawyer read aloud during the reading of the will. Family is not the people who share your blood, but family is the people who never let the door close. My mother sat across from me, her face pale, her composure finally cracking wide open. We are your parents, she said, as though that fact alone should erase everything that came before it. We made a mistake, Claire, but we are still your family. What? That money should stay where it belongs. You could share some of it with us. We are still your blood. I looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and then I looked down at Hazel, who was humming softly to herself, safe and warm and loved, exactly the way a child is supposed to be. Would. I thought about that flickering porch light 3 years earlier. I thought about giving birth completely alone, about Marisol staying late because she could not bear the thought of me suffering by myself, about every single meal I had stretched and every leaking pipe I had learned to fix, out of pure necessity. You did not want to be my family when it cost you nothing but a little embarrassment, I said quietly, so you do not get to be my family now that it might cost you something. Would. My mother's eyes welled up, and for just a moment I almost believed the tears were real. But then she spoke again, and her next words told me everything I needed to know. Think about Hazel's future, she said. Think about what that kind of money could do for her education, for her whole life. Would. And that was the moment I understood that even now, even sitting in my living room, having just watched my daughter for the very first time, my mother was still calculating, still looking for the angle that would get her what she came for. I am thinking about Hazel's future, I told her. That is exactly why the answer is no, because I do not want her growing up learning that love is something you show up for, only when there is a fortune attached to it. I want her to grow up knowing that the people who matter are the ones who stay through the hard years, Would, not just the profitable ones. My mother opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, cause for the first time in my entire life, I watched her realize there was nothing left to say that would change my mind. I stood up and walked to the front door, and this time, I was the one holding it open. My father left without saying another word. My mother lingered for just a moment longer, searching my face for any small crack in my resolve, any trace of the daughter granddaughter who used to beg for her approval. She did not find one. I closed the door behind them. Wood. And for the first time in 3 years, the silence inside my house felt like peace, instead of loneliness. In the month since that afternoon, I used part of what Arthur left behind to pay off every debt I had accumulated during those hard early years. Wood. I set aside a fund for Hazel's education so that she will never once have to worry about the things I worried about. And I kept my job with Renata, not because I needed the paycheck anymore, but because she gave me a chance when nobody else would. And loyalty like that is not something you walk away from just because your circumstances changed. I also used a portion of it to renovate the little house Hazel and I had built our whole world inside of. The same house where my parents once stood on the doorstep, reaching for a granddaughter they had no right to. Because that house was never really small to us. It was simply the place where we learned that we did not need anyone's permission to be a family. Some nights, after Hazel is asleep, I sit in the quiet and think about Arthur, a man I barely knew, who somehow understood exactly what real family meant better than the people who raised me ever did. And I think about that single line his attorney read aloud, the one about doors that never close, and I hope that wherever he is, he knows that his sparrow and hers turned out just fine. If you believe that real family is built through love and not through blood, and if you want to hear more true-to-life stories about people who found their strength again after being pushed away, hit that subscribe button right now and join us here at Hearthly Stories, because there are so many more stories just like Claire's still waiting to be told.